Good evening. It's been a busy and eventful day for the Apollo astronauts on their first full 24 hours in space. Most of the day has been taken up with Apollo chasing the Soyuz spacecraft ready for the link-up tomorrow. The Apollo crew have been working hard during the day to make up the time lost sorting out a jammed docking probe, which could have threatened the whole link-up. Mission Control at Houston, however, told ITN tonight the guys up there cleared up the problem just as we told them to. Provided all goes well from now on, they should be able to make that handshake over Bognor Regis tomorrow night as planned. We've been receiving television pictures from both Apollo and Soyuz, who've got their camera sorted out during the day, and we'll be seeing those in a minute. And here in our space studio, we'll be looking at the next half hour at some of the scientific experiments on the flight, the medical problems involved in sending men of over 40 years old into space, and how Kettering Grammar School tracks Russian space flights. But first, over to our science editor, Peter Fairley.
Well, the television pictures that we have had today have been of good quality, and the American pictures came in first. They were taken with a camera inside the command ship, which is a three-seater spaceship, but we only see two of the seats. This is Vance Brand, a new astronaut, sliding right past the camera to start it off. Tom Stafford in the background there, the commander of the mission. And now a view out of the spacecraft window at the carrier rocket that took them into orbit, just before the moment that they separated from it. They pull away about 50 feet clear. And now a view inside that docking tunnel where the trouble occurred earlier today. We see Deke Slayton, the oldest man ever to go into space there, 51 years old, using a pencil to read the instruction manual as he moves inside the docking tunnel to check out all of 1,000 working parts in there, make sure they're ready for the link-up with the Russians. Shot of Mission Control in Houston there. Back inside the tunnel, still showing Slayton. This is about 11 feet long and 5 feet in diameter, and it's a flying laboratory as much as just a tunnel. Tom Stafford checking a flight manual. They carry these documents usually strapped to their knees. And then Slayton passes right through the hatch that will ultimately lead him towards the Russian spaceship. Now, this is an interesting little historical event. This is a color camera test card, but on the back, a message has been written in Russian, and it's aimed at an astronaut who used to be in the space program called Wally Schirra, and it says, "Are you a turtle?" in Russian. It's an old astronaut joke. Undoubtedly, the Russians, who also have learned American for this trip, would have appreciated this joke, and we very shortly saw pictures from inside Soyuz showing there Alexei Leonov, the captain of the Russian craft, on the left, with Valery Kubasov, his engineer, on the right. And these were the pictures that we had been waiting for because the Russian television camera had broken down. It showed the two men inside what is called the orbital compartment, which is like a large round orange, about 9 feet in diameter. The Russians there wearing for the first time a mission patch, specially designed for this mission. You may, during the next few days, hear the call sign Soyuz 1, which will refer to Alexei Leonov, and Soyuz 2 to his co-pilot. And we hope for even better pictures tomorrow.
Well, this in front of me is the Kering Grammar School Space Tracking Station, would you believe? And their science master, Mr. Geoffrey Perry, is here with me. Kering Grammar School have had a remarkable record of achievements in tracking Russian space flights, and they've become something of acknowledged experts on the subject. And in fact, the American commander, Tom Stafford, said if he's got time going around at 17,500 miles an hour, he'll actually send them a message of welcome and greetings. Mr. Perry, we've got two things here. First of all, the globe. What is that doing?
This shows us where the spacecraft is at any time of the mission, but it's going so slowly in real time. I'll speed it up 30 times so that you can actually see how the orbit progresses. Now you can see we've left Newfoundland and we're chugging across the Atlantic. The spacecraft is shown by this little white Soyuz that we've got here.
Now, where did you get that from? Did you copy that from the Russians, or did they copy it from you?
No, we copied it from the Russians. They have a globe inside their spacecraft which shows the cosmonauts exactly where they are over the Earth at any instant. And I said to a retired engineer friend of mine, I said, Frank, I could do with a globe just like that so that we could see where the spacecraft we're tracking actually is. About a year later, he came up with this.
Well, you've been very successful with it. Now, this other piece of machinery here, which is bleeping away at us and pulsing out various signals, is the sharp end of your monitoring equipment, of the signals that come from the Soyuz back to Moscow Space Center. Is that right?
That's right. These signals are being picked up by a receiver in Kering. They're coming up a telephone line and onto this pen recorder here. This pen here is making these blue lodges. Every time you hear a bleep, we get a purple bar.
What information are you getting out of this?
Well, after that brrr, you get 15 words or values. Here's one brrr, there's the next, and there's 15 in between. And we can tell actually from past experience that the 6th and 7th of those tells us the pressure, first of all, in the orbital module of the Soyuz and then in the control module.
Now, this is all important, is it? Because if Soyuz 11 was when they lost 3 men, and you noticed that the pressure had dropped at that time.
Well, we were able to tell that nothing had gone wrong until the moment they separated. We saw the pressure go down in the orbital module prior to jettisoning, and we saw that they hadn't got a leak at that time. But of course, when they blew the things apart, ready for coming in, that's when the leak occurred, and that's when we lose our signals anyhow.
What have you've been monitoring a lot of their preliminary flights, I believe. What have you learnt so far about this flight?
Well, we know that they've been very careful with their preparations. They flew a manned Soyuz 16 as a dummy run, and they've flown 2 unmanned Cosmoses. With Soyuz 16, we actually saw them lower the pressure to what the Apollo pressure is, ready for docking. And they did this last night on Rev 5.
Why do you track the Russians only? Why not the Americans as well?
Well, it's easier to do the Russians. First of all, they're on shortwave, and you don't need a directional aerial. And as far as the American goes, apart from being difficult, everybody knows exactly what they're doing. You either read the press kits or you watch ITN.
Well, I hope so. Anybody, therefore, with this sort of equipment, I mean, presumably a radio ham, could pick up the same signals you're picking up. Is that right?
Yes, if he has a shortwave communications receiver, he can pick up this telemetry on 18.06 or 20.008 megahertz. And if he wants the voice, he needs an FM VHF receiver tuned to 142.4 or 121.75 megahertz.
Now, it seems to be running down. What's happening to it at the moment?
That's Doppler shift. That's as it goes by, you can track it. It's the way the police radar speed trap catches you.
And let's think about that. Now, the radio ham, if he picks up the signals, of course, he wouldn't know how to interpret them, would he?
No, he'd either have to spend an awful long time listening to it like we have, or read the technical literature. And of course, if he gets a voice, he'll have to learn Russian in a hurry.
Another thing that interests me very much about what you've been doing at Kering is you've been studying the stamps that the Russians issue after their space flights.
Yeah.
And you've actually, I believe, learnt something about their technology from this.
Yes, the Russian stamps are very accurate in the way they're drawn. We learnt from Soyuz 9, in fact, that there was no rendezvous radar, and that enabled us to tell what the 13th one was. This is rendezvous radar. It wasn't there for Soyuz 9 because it had nothing to rendezvous with. And there are 2 stamps at the moment which came out in March. These were the stamps for Soyuz 16. The one at the top, you'll see that this is the dummy run. It's got solar panels. to pick up the solar energy and turn it into electricity. Whereas Soyuz 17, which is shown in the lower stamp, docked to the Salyut 4 space station, that doesn't have solar panels. They don't need solar panels there. It's a 2-day Soyuz, a ferry ship, 1 day up, 1 day down. So if you want to know about the Soviet space program, buy the Russian stamps.
This one does have solar panels, doesn't it?
Oh yes,
Soyuz.
this one certainly needs it.
Characteristic of it, and has to be in the right position vis-a-vis the sun for a certain amount of hours.
That's right. In fact, we picked up voice saying that they were yawing at 3 degrees a minute in order to keep those panels exactly right angles to the sun as they went round the Earth.
Thanks very much. During the Link Up, the Russians and Americans will also be carrying out various scientific experiments. They hope, for instance, to find a new kind of radiation from the stars, and the Russians will also be photographing an artificial solar eclipse. Peter Fairley has been looking at these experiments and what they'll mean to us in the future.
There's quite a lot of astronomy to be done on this mission. Firstly, they're going to be searching for a particular type of radiation coming out of stars which has never been detected before. It's called extreme ultraviolet radiation, and if they can discover objects giving off this sort of radiation, then a whole new branch of astronomy will open up. Then the Russians are going to take pictures of the sun's halo using the cylindrical body of the Apollo spaceship as a kind of artificial eclipse. Apollo will back away about 600 feet until it exactly blots out the bright part of the sun, as seen from Soyuz. The Russians will then take pictures of the sun's halo around the edge. There's another experiment involving the two spaceships when they're pulled apart, and it's designed to measure how much oxygen and nitrogen there is on the fringes of the atmosphere. The Americans have a laser on the end of their docking tunnel, and the Russians have a reflector on the side of their spaceship. By firing a laser light beam towards the Russians and measuring how much light gets soaked up on the journey to and fro, it'll be possible to work out the concentration of those two gases in between. The Americans are also going to measure pollution in the atmosphere. Pollution which may come from meteorites raining in from outer space, from volcanoes puffing out fumes, or from the aerosols that we use as hair or paint sprays, where the gas floats upwards. And they'll do this with special instruments called photometers aboard the spaceship, which will look at the thick band of atmosphere seen each time the spaceship experiences sunrise or sunset. In other words, every time it goes around the world. What they want to test is whether these photometers could usefully be mounted aboard a satellite, which would automatically monitor pollution in the future. Reggie.
Well, Deke Slayton is the oldest astronaut ever to go into space. He's 51. He was a wartime bomber pilot, and he was once stationed in England during the war. Indeed, all the astronauts on this flight are over 40, which is quite encouraging for people like Peter Fairley and myself who are in that mature condition. Wing Commander Gordon Sharp is also in that condition. He's an aviation medicine consultant and an old hand himself in ITN space programs. Welcome back, Gordon. Why do they choose men of over 40 to go into space like this, and indeed a man of 51, when phantom jet pilots, for instance, are selected at the age of 19 or 20?
Well, of course, it's perfectly true that the aircrew of high-performance aircraft are recruited young, as indeed are the astronauts. And this is because it takes such a very long time to train them to the peak of perfection. Now, both the astronauts and the cosmonauts on this mission, they've been selected, of course, at a very much younger age than they are at the moment. They've undergone intensive training over the past many years, and they're all in excellent physical condition and indeed well able to cope with the rigors of spaceflight.
But two of them have never been in space before, and Deke Slayton is 51 years old and he's had a heart trouble. Why send them under those circumstances?
This is true. In Deke Slayton's case, it was his turn to go. What went wrong happened back in 1959 during a routine medical checkup, when it was found that he had an abnormal rhythm of his heart, a condition which we call atrial fibrillation. This appeared to get worse over the next few years, and space doctors, I think quite rightly, decided that it would be unwise to risk Slayton in spaceflight, and so he was withdrawn from active astronautics. To understand what happened to his heart, if we look at this model of a human heart, we can see that it's divided up into two lots of chambers which pump the blood round the body to supply all the tissues. And this pumping action is under the control of a little nervous tissue which is embedded deep in the heart, which gives it a sequenced and ordered rhythm. Now, when something goes wrong, as it did in Deke Slayton's case, the upper chambers of the heart start beating at quite an abnormal rhythm. They go out on their own, and of course, under this condition, the heart is much less efficient than it would be in normal rhythm.
I think if I could just break in there, it's very interesting because Deke Slayton was to have been one of the first 7 men into space, and he was grounded at the last minute, and then he ran the astronaut office in Houston in a dedicated fashion behind a desk for 10 years. He then convinced people that he was fit again, and they more or less said, well, in return for all that you've done, you can have your chance. But I think that some idea of the official disquiet about the medical condition of Deke Slayton could be gleaned from looking at the contents of the medical kit on this mission, and I've never seen anything like it before. On this flight, for the very first time, there are 70 cardiac pills and 120 cardiac injections, which are there purely as a standby, but it just shows that they are pretty terrified in case anything were to happen to Deke Slayton's heart under a weightlessness condition, which they cannot simulate on Earth, and so they cannot be totally sure about.
Gordon, what would happen, of course one hopes it won't, but what would happen if anything went wrong with Deke Slayton's heart in space? Would they bring him back straight away?
Well, it would depend very much. The first thing they would do, obviously, is to give him one of the medicines, the pills that are being carried. If that didn't work, and as I say, the heart is in a much less efficient state under this abnormal rhythm, then they would certainly have to think about bringing him back.
So they're taking a risk for sentimental reasons, in a
Yes,
way,
they are, but of course they are being, all the astronauts, including Deke Slayton, are being monitored very closely and very carefully by doctors back at Mission Control. In fact, they are keeping a very close watch on the electrical activity of the heart, which is being transmitted from the spacecraft back to Earth, and the doctors at Mission Control are watching an oscilloscope rather like this one, making certain that everything's all right with the heart rhythm.
The next sort of paradox in this is why the two spaceships have different atmospheres. What's the answer to that?
Well, the Russians have always used an atmosphere in their spacecraft which is rather similar in composition and at the same pressure as the gas which we are breathing here on Earth. Whereas the Americans, they've used pure oxygen at a very much lower pressure. Now, the Russians have reduced the pressure in this mission, in their spacecraft, and this is to avoid the danger of decompression sickness when the Russians have to move into the American spacecraft. This decompression sickness is a condition very much like divers' bends, when the diver comes up to the surface too quickly. And what happens in the condition can be demonstrated really quite simply with a bottle of soda water, because the gas which is dissolved in the astronaut's blood, when he reduces pressure going into the American craft, he reduces pressure and the gas comes out of solution and fizzes. It bubbles. Now, these bubbles, if they get trapped in various parts of the body, can give rise to this very nasty and very fatal condition. Well, this we think won't happen, of course, because precautions have been taken.
Are there any other medical hazards?
Well, not so much hazards. We've got a rather annoying condition which may occur when the Americans eat their space food with the Russians, their cabbage soup. They're almost certain to swallow some of the spacecraft air with that food, and of course during the normal processes of digestion, gas is going to be formed in the bowel. Occasionally, what happens when the astronauts change pressure, as they will have to do when they return to the American craft, is that the gas expands in the bowel. This stretches the wall of the bowel and can cause quite severe discomfort.
Are you talking about the phenomenon which is euphemistically known as wind?
That's quite correct. Most people can avoid this wind and it causes no trouble, but some of the astronauts have in the past had difficulty and may well suffer this rather unpleasant condition.
Gordon, thank you very much. Well, the political implications of this link-up are obvious. It is one of the first examples that East and West can actually work together, albeit out in space. But are we being naive in assuming that this flight is entirely for peaceful purposes? Geoffrey Perry, I'd like to come back to you and Kering. and your experience, are we being sort of having the wool pulled over our eyes? Could either side be using this for military purposes?
I don't think they're using this mission for military purposes, but you've got to remember that well over 50% of the Russian total space program is military, and a large proportion of the American space program is run by their Air Force for military reasons.
Can you give any examples of the way in which this might be used militarily, or that the space program is being used militarily?
Well, about 30 Cosmos satellites a year are reconnaissance satellites. They take photographs of interesting targets on the ground. We've got a slide which shows how they were able to cover the war in Bangladesh. Here you see the orbit numbers for Cosmos 464. You'll notice that orbits 12, 28 and 44 are evenly spaced. This is as the Earth turns under the orbit, and this is a daily progression. But when they got somewhere near Dakar, that's the dark green area, you notice that they lowered the orbit. So not only can they put the satellite up there to go over the Earth, they can keep it where they want it, over the target area. And they got it back after 6 days to get the pictures in a hurry. There was something similar at the time of the Middle East War. We were able in Kering to tell that the war on the Golan Heights had finished and that the activity had transferred to Suez long before it was announced. The reason being that the Russians, instead of flying their later Cosmoses at the 65-degree angle to the equator, suddenly changed to 72.9 degrees. Now this gave them total coverage of Suez, missed Golan Heights, and it enabled them to get pictures direct from the satellite back into Yevpatoria in the Crimea.
So what you're saying is you had an indication that the fighting in Golan was over before it actually happened?
Yeah,
by the movement of a satellite?
That's right.
What can they actually see from up there?
Well, it's surprising. There's a picture being released, taken from Skylab, and it shows an area of Florida. Now, the little square which you can see there, if you blow that up to about something like 80 times magnification, you can actually see on the airfield 3 swept-wing aircraft, the ones with the circle around them.
Now, if satellites have this degree of significance, there's something one has read about and heard about called a hunter-killer satellite, which goes up and knocks down or out other people's satellites. Have you any knowledge of these?
Well, the Russians tried this system out 2 or 3 years ago, but they didn't knock down somebody else's satellites. They put their own target up, and then after a suitable time, they sent up what we call a seek and destroy type. It made its rendezvous with it, and then exploded and moved into a different orbit. Well, if you can do that to your own satellites, they are obviously showing the potentiality to do it to somebody else's. They tried it at various heights. They tried knocking out a low reconnaissance satellite. They tried knocking out the communications types. It's operational, but it's never been used against anybody else.
It's also, I mean, it occurs that space, as you say, has obviously been used for purely military purposes. Is it used for missile navigation?
Yeah, there's a Cosmos system of navigation satellites, and the American have their own transit system of satellites. You see, if you've got a missile which you can aim accurately, say to within 100 metres or 100 yards, then you better know where you are when you let it go. So the submarines, which spend most of their time under the water, they need to know accurately where they are before they light the blue touch paper and send their missile winging off towards its target.
From your experience of tracking all these things, what do you reckon's up there?
Well, there's over 3,000 pieces actually in orbit, but they're not all working. Now, there aren't any bombs up there. I think bombs would be silly things to put into orbit because you can only get them down in particular places at particular times. In the end, you might find you can only bomb your friends and you can't bomb your enemies.
And from everything that you and Kering have heard today, this mission's going well, is it?
This mission's all right, yes, I should think so.
And
we're looking for 100% success anyhow.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Well, tomorrow all 5 astronauts have their big moment at 5:15 when they have that handshake and the dock. Well, they don't have the handshake at 5:15, they dock at 5:15, the clunk click, and then the handshake comes later at 8:18, and we'll be on the air for both those programs. We'll be on the air at 10 to 5, and we hope to get some good pictures of the spacecraft approaching, and then we'll be on the air at 8:18, and now all the cameras are working. We should be able to show you pictures from both the Soyuz and the Apollo without any trouble. Finally, you may be interested to know that shortly after launch, the American astronauts found an unlisted passenger aboard. They called it a super Florida mosquito. It was buzzing around the capsule. How it got in there, nobody quite knows. Its fate is, however, sealed. They're going to feed it for a few days, presumably not on themselves. But they're going to feed it, and they're going to serve it to a tropical fish, which they've got on the flight for one of the later scientific experiments. And with that thought in mind, join us tomorrow.